Okay, this is something you can be asked in the exam. You're given some data, you're given a role, and you have to decide in that role, what would you be interested in? And you've got to make sure that what you're looking at is relevant to what the person would want to know. So this is a person putting together a publication for a travel agent about weather into tourist locations. So if I was in that position, what about this data might I be interested in? Okay. Now, actually, I'm tempted to start with the last question here, which is what question or questions might we ask? Because I think actually this is clearly inadequate information for the kind of task we've got. Okay, if I'm actually analysing the weather in two different tourist locations, if you look at all of this data, it's all from July 2015. Okay, now if I'm doing a publication, then surely I'll want to know about the weather at different times of year. Okay, and surely I'll want to have more than 1 year's worth of data, because the Julys in 2015, July weather may not have been typical of other Julys. Now, the other kind of thing to think about when you're asked about what questions would you need to ask is any lack of precision in what's being measured. Now here, they have been fairly precise. So it tells me this is the daily mean air temperature. Okay. Now, does that mean across the whole 24 hours of a day? Okay. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. If it is across the whole 24 hours of the day, there may be a big difference between nighttime and daytime temperatures. So that could be another thing we could ask. So you need to ask a kind of question that shows that you've really looked at the data carefully and related to it what you might need to know. I think I'd be more interested in the daytime temperatures than the nighttime temperatures, unless I thought I was going to freeze to death at night. Okay, let's get back to the earlier questions. What would we investigate? Well, presumably, if we're working for a tourist agency, okay, and weather, we need to be advising tourists on aspects of the weather they think would be important to them. So of the things I've got here, which of these do I think tourists would care about? I think they would care about the temperature. I think they'd care about rainfall. I don't think they'd care much about pressure. They might care about how windy it is, and I've got two different measures of that. So let's say that our question is, what are the significant differences between, this refers to July, so I'd better make it about July, the July temperature, rainfall, and wind speeds in these two locations. So here we go. What differences will tourists notice between those three measurements in July in these two locations? So how would I investigate it, and what different statistical diagrams would I draw to represent the data? Okay, now the middle two questions kind of go together, because what I do to investigate the differences, okay, what particular kinds of differences I decide to look for will affect what kind of diagrams I choose to draw. So I'm going to do these two kind of together. So for what might I be interested in for the temperatures here? Well, I think people are going to want to know roughly how warm it is, but they're also going to want to know about whether it's consistently warm or whether there's a lot of variation in that. So I'm going to look for the average temperature and variations in temperature. Okay, if there were lots of marks, I might start talking about measures of centre and measures of spread that I can use. So in an exam, you'd look at how many marks are allocated. I think I'm going to stop there. That's what I'm going to investigate, okay? And the how of it is going to be completed when I talk about the diagrams I'm going to use. The next thing I said I'd look at is rainfall. Now, I'm going to simplify this a little bit. I think if I'm a tourist, then what I really care about is whether I'm going to get rained on or not, okay? So I'm going to actually maybe want to contrast the days that were completely dry with the days when it rained. So that's a really very simple question about rainfalls. So compare the proportion of days which were dry. And then for my wind, I've got two different measures of wind speed. Okay. Normally, if I've got this kind of data, this is categorical, this is qualitative data, it's not numbers. So that would be an invitation to maybe use a pie chart. However, you can see from this data that it would be an extremely boring pie chart, especially this one here. So let's not use that. Let's look at the wind speeds themselves. Okay, so I could actually want to get right into the detail and say, compare the overall pattern of the wind speeds at each location. Okay, so Now I've got to turn these kind of ideas for what I would investigate into what diagrams would answer these. So what kind of diagram will show me the variations and the typical temperatures and the variations in temperature? Well, the one kind of diagram that does that and virtually nothing else is your box plot. So it says describe it in detail, so I have to say the full detail. Draw box plots of July temperatures in Perth and in Jacksonville. All of mine are going to be comparisons between Perth and Jacksonville. Sometimes you'll be given data where you can do different kinds of comparisons. But here the brief was very clearly to look at the weather in these two particular locations. Now for the next one, the proportion of days which were dry, something that's good for showing proportions of a whole is a pie chart. Now we've got more information than we're actually using. Because this is actually numerical data, you might often want to do something a bit more sophisticated than a pie chart. But I've actually gone from, my question has gone from the actual numbers to just dry versus wet. So I've in effect taken it from being qualitative data to quantitative. And so a pie chart is reasonable for that. So I can say draw a pie chart for each location showing the proportions of dry and rainy days. And finally, for the overall pattern of wind speeds, so draw a histogram for each location showing wind speeds. I've just about managed to squeeze that on. Now, did I have these kinds of diagrams in mind when I thought of the comparisons I was going to do? Well, of course I did. So you need to think forwards and backwards in these. So while I was thinking what I might want to compare, I was thinking about what diagrams I could use to do that comparison, bearing in mind that for some reason they say I need to do 3 different types of statistical diagrams. They could do that in the exam. Actually, there's no particular reason why in real life they would want to use different types of diagrams, maybe to try and make it look more attractive on the page or rubbish like that. Sometimes it will be appropriate to use the same type of diagram every time. But if the exam question asks for different types of diagrams, that's what we've got to do. Okay. So, overall structure, read the whole question before you even start. Okay. So in this particular one, my eye was drawn to the very last, the limitations. It's good to have thought of that before you even decide what questions you can ask, because the questions you've asked has got to be answerable by the data.